Well, good morning, everyone. God bless you, and thank you so much for joining this study, continuing in the book of First Samuel, chapter 8. Again, I just pray that you are being blessed by what God's Word has to say. And last week we left off in somewhat of a sad ending. Um, and as I'm preparing to teach this today, kind of I feel a little sad in heart because it's like as I'm reading this, I'm picking up the sadness that God felt in his heart over this situation. I know that there are many times when, obviously God is in control of everything and he has the ability and the power to intervene in every circumstance. But we're going to see here in today's lesson that God doesn't want to be a dictator. He doesn't want to. He never acts against our free will. In fact, I've heard someone's actually purport that the strongest force in the universe is our free will, because God will not override our will, our free will. And many times in the scriptures, we see that things happen slowly, that God's will took time to be developed. And I believe as we look through that, we find obviously it wasn't because God didn't desire to do something, it's because of his benevolence towards us that he waits until our wills are finally in alignment with his will, that he can then allow his work to be done. And again, it's still somewhat of a mystery, as it comes back to the question, did you find God or did God find you? And I believe when we can answer that question is when we truly begin to understand um, more of the scriptures and more of the way that God has dealt with mankind and continues to deal with mankind. Um, and of course, this was a pivotal week in the history here or in the United States, because of the election going on. And I think it's very interesting of that our lesson today covers somewhat of a similar topic. I don't say it's correlated, or I don't believe there's any hidden messages or things in here that are meant to, say what happened and however you feel in your political party, what's right, what's wrong. But I believe there is something to be seen here in attitudes and in desires, and maybe not even so much our desires, but what is God's desire. And so, with that, we pick up from last week, just to recap on verse 7, with this verse that obviously elicited a lot of emotions and from the heart of God, and how it resonates in our hearts today. And God is saying, that to Samuel. Samuel was feeling bad that the people wanted a king, and God is reminding Samuel that they haven't rejected you, Samuel. They have rejected me from being a God over them and reigning over them. So now we get to verse 8, and we hope to finish, chapter 8 today and take it all the way through the end. And there's going to be a lot that we read over, but I trust that you will gain something of an understanding, that there'll be an emotion that comes through this part of what we read. I didn't get it at first. At first I read through it and it seemed like a lot of words that I wasn't relating to. But as I'm here this morning, there's an emotion that goes with this. There's something that I feel, that I trust you will feel, coming from the heart of God, over how he feels over what his people are doing here. So he says, it goes on in verse 8, this is God talking and continuing, that they didn't want God to reign over them. And he reminds Samuel of all the works which these people of Israel have done since the day that he brought them up out of Egypt. Again, this is something that we as humans, we forget and have to be reminded. And how does the cliche go? He that ignores history is doomed to repeat it because we forget. And it's very much human nature. And that's why it's necessary for us to have a life that is, we'll call it discipline, is where disciple came from. It's have a life where we remind ourselves on a daily basis how we got to where we are today, why we are who we are today, and look back. And the purpose is to be able to recognize God's hand in why we're in this position, and that He has kept us. I trust everyone that's listening to this podcast here, this recording. You are alive. You are breathing. You are not in a means of starvation. We may have different things that have affected us and different illnesses, but we are alive here today. And if there's nothing else to be thankful for, that you can realize just to be in a place where we are listening to this and we are alive is enough to start with a basis for thanking God and realizing that there are many who are not here today. There are many who have perished from numerous things. Uh, Natural causes, COVID disease, accidents, all other kind of diseases that ravish our humanity. But you are alive today. You are here today, and let's thank God for that. And so I think that's what God's trying to do here, is He's reminding. And he remembers how he had brought them out of Egypt, delivered them, but yet they have forsaken him. Again, it's almost unfathomable to think here they are in the presence of God. They see the pillar of cloud by day. They see the pillar of fire by night. Um, you know, they've been delivered. They have all the miracles. And even though this is, somewhat after the fact, in this transition from prophets to kings, God was still there in their midst. He just had delivered them from a mighty battle that, uh, you know, but yet here they are turning away from him. And we don't know how much time had passed, but we know that regardless, they are forsaking him. And this is how God is viewing it. It doesn't matter how the people perceived it. It doesn't matter how they rationalized why they did what they did. God is seeing it as they have forsaken him. And that's all that matters. It's They always say that politics is perception. Our reality is basically based upon our perception of things. There's three ways to see something. There's the your way. Excuse me. There's the right way. There's the wrong way, and then there's my way. And we don't. How do we see things objectively? How do we really see the truth in the matter? And that's why we need to go to God's word, and we need to have him direct us, at least in my life, to override my emotions, to override my thoughts, and try to bring them all into alignment with what his thoughts are and his will for us. And so to God, they had forsaken him, and they've served other gods. Now, yes, we know that they had other images that they set up, but this whole idea of serving other gods can encompass many different ideologies, many different things that we put our trust in other than the one true God, that could be looked at as other gods that we may rationalize and say, well, I didn't mean that, or that's not my intention. But that's not what's going on here. This is how God looks at it. How do I find out what he really thinks of what I'm doing or what I'm thinking or how I'm worshiping, so to speak, to find his understanding? So in God's eyes, his understanding, they are worshiping other gods. And here God says something quite interesting. He knows what they want. God knows what his perfect will is, but here he acquiesces. He gives in. He, in verse 9, says, "Give heed to them now, to their voice. Let them get what they ask for." There's, I think, even a song that says, "Be careful what you wish for, you just might get it all." And another one that says, "Thank God for unanswered prayers," because um, we don't really want what we want. I mean, if we're really thinking about it and we really understand the whole scope of the situation, I can't trust my desires. I can't trust my intellect. All I can trust is how God sees it and how He knows. And there's no greater way to seek after God's will than to just say, Lord, not my will, but thy will be done. And so, God is speaking to them here, and he's saying, listen to what they ask for. But he says, I want you to solemnly forewarn them and show them what's going to happen. Now, this is really kind of interesting too, because I have never been confronted with a choice where suddenly God speaks to me and says, "Well, Wayne, if you make this choice, here's what you're going to get." Um, I think if that would happen to all of us, it would certainly, I would think right now this would guide our behavior and influence our behavior. Well, that's what I like to think. But as we look at the evidence here, we're going to see that this didn't matter to them at all. So, human nature being what it is, and knowing that the scriptures portray human nature in a very plain and understandable way and better than we can understand it ourselves, we would have to concur that even if God told us the consequences, which he has through his word, we know what the wages of sin being death, you can't get much stronger than that. Um, It'd be wonderful if that was enough of a deterrent that we would never sin again. It's intended to be. We struggle with that, each and every one of us. But here we see that God is being extra benevolent to them and outlining in quite a lot of detail what their life is going to be like under the kingship of this king that is coming in. And so we'll read through this somewhat quickly. You'll get the gist of it, but through it all, I'm picking up just how disappointed God is in being rejected. So God tells them to to instruct Samuel to speak to the people. What's interesting here, and you see this in the Hebrew, I'm kind of circling it with my cursor here, you see that the word Yahweh is used as God is speaking, which is still telling us that the words, and it uses the word devar or divrei, meaning the words that God is speaking. These are from his heart. These are not just frivolous commentary, not frivolous you know, speech created by a speechwriter. These are words coming from God's heart, and it's showing his compassion towards them, yearning and pleading that as he tells them what's going to happen, I believe he's all the while wanting them to just get a wake up call here and that they can stop their forward progress at any time and go back to what God wants them to. And so I picked that up through this. So uh, so Samuel told all the words of Yahweh to the people, these people who had asked him for a king. I wonder if there were some there that didn't go along with it. What you don't see is, the dissenting party. You don't see, one group rising up and saying, "No, we don't want a king. We want to stay with God." It gives you the impression that all of them went for it, wanted a king. But yet, there are other instances in the scriptures where we see that, like when the people followed the and worshiped the golden calf, created the golden calf, there was a remnant there who did not follow after them. And we saw them kind of after the fact come up. So I believe that in the midst of these millions of Israelites, there were some who saw what was happening. There were some who did not want a king. But as we see here, we don't hear their voices. We see that God is addressing what appears to be the majority of the people there. And of course, that's an interesting topic. I don't want to read too much into that here, but I'm glad to know that, no matter what happens in this world, no matter what happens in the future, there will always be a people, I believe, that will stay true to God. There will always be a people that follow His way and that don't go with the majority, that don't go with whatever is popular or whatever is the new thing, but stay true to God's precepts. And so Samuel is telling them, and he said, "Here's what this king will be like. Here's what life's going to be like. Here's what the king's going to do. He's going to reign over you. He's going to take your sons, and of course, they're going to be pressed into military service." What's also interesting here is he mentions the word chariots, and he mentions the word horsemen. Now, back in when Moses received the law, the Ten Commandments, the guidance, one of the guidance that God had put down is that you don't fight your battles the way everyone fights their battles. He restricted them from having chariots and from having horses. And of course, there's a song in Psalms where it says, some trust in chariots, some trust in horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord our God, made into a very famous song that we used to sing, kind of a children's song. This is the reason for it. God did not want them fighting the same way that the world fought, that all other nations. So he forbid them from having chariots. He forbid them from having horsemen. Here he's telling them, look what's going to happen. You want to be like other nations? You're going to have to fight like other nations. You're going to go and gather to yourselves chariots and horsemen. Your sons are going to be pressed into service and be a part of this type of a battle that you've never fought this way before. You have no experience in it, but you're going to be fighting in this way of battle that you're not accustomed to because God won't be in it. They're going to have to do it on their own. It talks about how many people are going to be pressed in. They'll have captains over hundreds and thousands and fifties. In addition, taxes are going to go up. You're going to have taxes. You're going to have to support this new regime. Here he's saying that some of you will have to work the ground and uh, so that you can support this and grow crops. And what you grow and harvest are going to be the king's. This is going to be used to raise money to create weapons of war and warfare. And someone's got to pay for the chariots. Someone's got to pay for all the weapons of war. Someone's got to pay to feed these horses that you're going to have. It says he's going to take your daughters and press them into the things that create a lavish lifestyle for the king. It talks about perfumers and cooks. It's all about creating a new type of lifestyle for this elite that really doesn't exist right now. You had your prophets, you had your holy men, the priests, but there really wasn't this elite, powerful group of people that now this is being created of a kingdom, of a realm of royalty that are going to take servants, that are going to take people to support them. And God is telling them there's going to be bakers and there's going to be vineyards and grape growers and olive groves, and all these things are going to have to be provided to keep the king happy, to support this royalty. You're going to have to, he's going to have servants. Actually uses the word here for slaves, um, and we know that they would be pressed into serving the king. He's going to take your grain. And here's something interesting. It mentions about an amount that he will take a tenth. Um, that's something that obviously is a common thread through a lot of the scriptures of when something is given to um, someone, either to God or to kings. It's typically a tenth. And of course, that has number has changed as society has changed, but it's interesting to see it mentioned here that the king would take a tenth. This also plays into stories in the New Testament where Jesus is being tempted by the lawyers, and they say, "Is it lawful to give unto Caesar?" And of course, Jesus knows that they're trying to trick him, and he asks to see a coin. And where this all comes in is the Caesars had demanded a tenth of the income to be paid to them as a tax. And the Jewish people knew that paying a tenth was really meant to be ascribed only to God. And so they really rebelled at this when the Romans required a tenth, which they felt a tenth was only meant to be given to God. And so this all plays into these New Testament instances that we read about and gives them a little, it gives us a better depth of understanding. And so it talks about the servants and the officers, verse 16, and there'll be men servants and maid servants and this whole court. He's going to take the finest of the young men and the finest of the animals and put them to his work and create this whole empire. Of animals and sheep, and he'll, again, here comes the word, a tenth of the sheep. He'll take slaves, and once this all happens, guess what? He says, you're going to wake up. You're going to see that this was not a better situation. You're going to see that you made a mistake. And verse 18, God says, you will cry out in that day. You'll cry out because of the king whom you have chosen. You will regret it, and you'll wish you would have never done it. God's telling him that. And something, again, this is almost just almost preposterous to think about. We don't want to even understand it in a way that it's coming in here, because that, again, when you read scripture, there's the face value. There's the words as they first hit you, and as you read them, it's called the peshat. Then after that, you realize that, okay, I need to investigate this a little bit closer, and then you start digging deeper. But when you first read this, God is saying that after you're crying out, you found you made a mistake, you don't like your king, and you start crying out to me, he's going to say, I will not hear you in that day. I will not hear you. Now it's, again, the translation here is somewhat, remember, Hebrew is a emotional language. It's not a scientific language. Hebrew is not a precise language because the words can have many different meanings. And so the translators are always very stifled by um, their understanding and restricted by their knowledge. And so, again, there's even a commentary that says that all translations are traitors. And the meaning behind that is that there isn't any translation that can truly give the accurate understanding because they're limited in what words they can use. Also, translations are bound by the ideologies, by the belief systems, by the knowledge of the person doing the translating will always bring into their translation their own feelings and their own emotions. It's impossible to avoid that. There is no such thing as a completely benign translation. There is no such thing as a completely non-sectarian, non-denominational translation, because no matter what a person believes, their thoughts will be wound and woven into the words that they choose to translate. And so we see that when we go into the Hebrew scriptures, that we can see there are a number of different ways to take some of these words. And so when you look at how this is translated by the translators, saying that God will not hear their prayer, it's like boom, he's giving up. He's just throwing in a towel, and he's going to just let them suffer all the consequences of what they've done. God will not hear, he will not answer. Don't ask, don't call me. I'm gone. That's basically the impression you get here. But there are some things here that tell us that isn't what God was meaning. The word shane here is somewhat of a play on the word shemer. To shema means to hear, but really what he's saying is the answer, the response. It's not that he won't hear anymore. It's just that the answer and the response may be different than what you are expecting. And so that's it's not that he won't hear, it's that he will not respond the way maybe speedily, maybe he won't respond the way you are expecting. Because what I see here is the word for God is being used in the compassionate form of Yahweh. If he was wishing to execute judgment, if he was wishing to teach them a lesson, so to speak, it would have said Elohim and been a form of that name terminology used for God. But when I see the word Yahweh here, I know that God is still in his merciful, compassionate mode. And so I don't believe this is as harsh as some of the translations come out. Um, and so uh, I take great comfort in knowing that God is still in the situation here. Um, and so as we look at this, we see that God will still hear. It's just that he may not answer. And that's where having these scriptures available in the original languages really help us to understand what God's heart is. The other thing that we know about is when we read the rest of the commentary, read the rest of the scriptures, we know that God never forsook his people, that he was always there. We see it in the life of Samuel as he goes to pick King Saul. He's directed by God to pick him, very much involved in Saul's life. We do see that he turns from Saul when Saul, we will see that when Saul rejects the proper teaching. And then God speaks, and Samuel goes and anoints David, a man after God's own heart. So we never see a time where God, as the scripture talks about here, or I'll say the translation speaks here, ever turned a deaf ear and said, I won't hear you anymore. I'll never answer you. Um, I'm done with you. We don't see that being taken place. So this verse has to be, our thinking of it has to be adjusted based upon what the actual outcome was, what the actual reality is that we see in the scriptures later on down the road, that God never leaves them, never forsakes them, is always open with a compassionate and merciful heart, waiting to receive those back in when they turn to him. And we'll see many times that they cried out to God and God answered them and gave them deliverance. So this verse is not all that it was translated to be, even though we do see that God's heart is breaking through this. And even in the midst of this, verse 19, the people refused to obey. They just said, no, we want it our way. And so they said, we want a king. We want him to rule over us, that we may be like all other nations, that our king may judge us, that our king may go and fight for us and fight our battles. Again, I could feel the grief. I can feel the breaking of God's heart over the rejection that he felt when these words were being spoken. Because remember, they're not rejecting Samuel, they're rejecting God. And they're wanting not, they don't want God's authority. They don't want God's kingdom anymore. They want what they think is right in their own eyes. And what's interesting here is Samuel heard this, the words of the people, and then it says something very strange. It says that he repeated them in the hearing of Yahweh. Okay, why would he have to do that? Wasn't God listening? Wasn't God there to hear all of this? But what you pick up, or at least what I pick up, is that there's an exchange here of broken hearts, of Samuel's heart being broken, and God's heart being broken. And the two of them are somewhat consoling each other. I believe that they are trying to support each other, and Samuel's reaching out to God, and so they're having this conversation. In fact, the whole structure of the sentence is quite strange because there's some repetition going on here. So it says the words of the people that Samuel repeated in the hearing of Yahweh, and then verse 22 says, so said to Yahweh, um, and they're talking this over and they're saying it over and over again, when in reality Samuel wouldn't have had to say anything. God heard, God knew what was going on before the people ever said anything. But yet there's this discussion of what's going on, that I believe it was a very intimate discussion of of being in God's presence and sharing the hurt and the heartbreak, not only of Samuel, but also of God as they share this together, because Samuel was definitely on the same wavelength that God was on. Samuel was definitely knowing the heart of God, feeling the heart of God, and sharing this heartbreak together. And so God says to him, listen to them, take heed to them, and go and make them a king. And then Samuel said to the men of Israel, and again, the wording is very short here. Obviously, he said a whole lot more. He just said, everybody go home. It says, Samuel said to the men of Israel, go every man to his city. They must have come to an understanding that God was um, going to grant their request, or at least in their mind, maybe Samuel was going to grant their request. I don't know if they even cared what God wanted to do at that time, but they had an understanding that things were going their way because they disassembled. Their whole gathering dispersed. They were content enough to go every man to back home again, back to their city, and wait for God and Samuel to take the next step. And so with that, we finished the end of this chapter. It's kind of interesting just to show you a little bit that you don't see in your English translations is at the end of this structure of sentences, of verses, you'll see a little, it's called a pay, kind of looks like a little head with a little shape of a face and a little tooth. It represents the letter P as we know it. It's they call it just the punctuation, but it's really the ending of a chapter. And in this case, it's the ending of a thought. It's the ending of almost an era, if you will, of things changing in the lives of the Israelites. And it gets to the end, and it just doesn't end in a period, or it just doesn't stop. There's a marker put here in the Hebrew language that just says, it's kind of like a sigh. It's kind of like we're at the end of this. Change is happening. Things are happening. We're just going to stop. We're just going to take this time out here and let God orchestrate the next move. So with that, I pray that you were uh, blessed and informed by this lesson. And again, the purpose of it is to show that God is in control. God knows what's happening. God gave us this indication in His Word just to show His emotion, His heart, His feelings. And it still always reinforces how much God truly loves you, truly loves me, wants to be a part of our lives, and is just desiring for us to submit our will to His will. So God bless all of you. I pray that you have a wonderful day, and thank you again so much, and look forward to talking with you again next week.